Currently, Sweden is turning a resort area into a military fortress. Anticipating a possible Russian invasion, they are fortifying the entire island. Let's take a closer look at this today. Let's take a look right away. A Guardian report states that Gotland, Sweden's largest Baltic island, is becoming the front line of Europe's security strategy against Russia's military threat. Gotland is located about 275 kilometers from Kaliningrad, which is also a key Russian military stronghold. It's about 87 kilometers from the Swedish mainland. As you can see on the map, it's located right in the middle of the Baltic. After the end of the Cold War, it was a resort area, but now they've started to fortify it. In fact, Sweden sees the threat from Russia as a very real security issue. That means they place a very high strategic value on Gotland. When the Swedish Ministry of Defense established its defense plan for 2025 to 2030, it included a surprise attack on Gotland as one of the 7 key security scenarios that must be prepared for. This means that even if Russia does not start a full-scale war, they are specifically considering a situation where Russia could quickly concentrate its air and naval forces to seize control of the skies and seas around Gotland in a short period of time. Sweden thinks if this happens, warship and aircraft movement in the Baltic Sea could be heavily limited, putting major pressure on nearby countries' defense systems. In particular, since the Baltic Sea is an important area for the movement and supply of NATO's northern forces, analysts believe that if control over this region is shaken, it will not only be a problem for Sweden, but could rapidly worsen the security environment for all of Northern Europe. Sweden views Gotland as more than an island for regional defense. It's a key strategic base for protecting the Baltic Sea. A military commander leading troops in the field also expresses this perspective. Andreas Gustafsson, the Swedish army commander stationed in Gotland, emphasized the island's strategic importance by stating that controlling Gotland means being able to control the Baltic Sea. He added that this area must be defended for both Sweden and all of NATO. This statement shows Gotland's defense is not just about Sweden's borders, but is also tied to NATO's collective defense system. In fact, this is exactly why NATO has used Gotland as a base for joint exercises and force deployment since Sweden joined. If this island were to fall into the hands of the adversary, it would become much easier to monitor or contain ships and aircraft moving throughout the Baltic. That's why Sweden considers Gotland the first area that must be defended. In fact, the reason the international community is paying attention to Gotland is not just because of the value of the island itself, but because of the overall military importance of the Baltic. Gotland is the largest island in the Baltic and is located very close to Kaliningrad, which is Russian territory. This place has long been seen as strategic due to its prime position for monitoring maritime routes, warships, and aircraft in the Baltic. Recently, the security environment has changed a lot. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, most Baltic neighbors are now NATO members. From Russia's perspective, the space in which it can operate in the Baltic has been greatly reduced, and Kaliningrad is now surrounded by NATO countries. Analysis suggests Russia sees this type of military pressure as burdensome. If Russia seized Gotland or gained a position to apply ongoing military pressure during a crisis, the situation could shift dramatically. There is a high possibility that the activities of warships, supply ships, and transport vessels passing through the Baltic Sea could be restricted, and NATO could face significant difficulties in supporting the Baltic states with troops and equipment. The Baltic states connect to NATO by land, but maritime supply lines are also crucial, making control of the Baltic Sea a key factor at the start of any war. Military experts think the Baltic Sea's operational environment could shift based on which power has influence over Gotland. Tensions around the Baltic states have been steadily increasing. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all geographically close to Russia and are the countries observing Russia's military activities more closely than anyone else. If tensions rise in the Baltic states are likely to be the first affected regions. That's why NATO has been steadily increasing its troops and equipment in this region and is enhancing its response capabilities by expanding joint exercises in the Baltics. Russia continues military actions focused on the Baltic fleet, so both sides' military movements remain closely intertwined. The Baltic region is becoming crucial for European security, raising concerns that even a minor clash could escalate tensions more than anticipated. The military importance of Gotland was already confirmed several times during the Cold War. At that time, up to 25,000 troops were stationed on the island, serving as a key base for the defense of the Baltic. As the Cold War ended, disarmament spread across Europe, and Sweden believed its security environment had greatly improved. As a result, Gotland station units were gradually reduced, and by 2005, the last regiment was disbanded, making the island nearly demilitarized. At the time, there was a strong perception that the possibility of a large-scale military conflict was low, so it was considered unnecessary to maintain a massive military force. However, this judgment changed completely when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The Swedish government viewed Russia's growing military actions in the Baltic region as a serious threat and concluded that military pressure on the Baltic states could increase significantly. Accordingly, Sweden began to restore Gotland's defense capabilities, which had been reduced for a while, and is now pursuing a rearmament plan to gradually increase troops, facilities, and equipment. Sweden is building a system to rapidly deploy 4,500 troops in emergencies and is continuing to review further troop increases. Sweden's changes go beyond rearming Gotland, as it is also overhauling its national defense policy. The Swedish government has announced a plan to increase its defense budget to 3.5% of GDP by 2030. This is the largest defense buildup since the Cold War, focusing on expanding personnel, equipment, air defense, naval power, and long-range strike capabilities to boost military strength. This reflects the assessment that current capabilities will make it difficult to respond to the future security environment. Ulf Kristersson, Sweden's prime minister, stated that current defense spending is insufficient. He emphasized that NATO member countries must make significant progress in strengthening their defense capabilities within the next few years, and mentioned that NATO's new defense spending standard also needs to be raised to about 3 to 4% of GDP. This statement reflects the recognition that the European security environment has entered a completely different phase than before, going beyond the previous minimum standard of 2%. To implement this rearmament plan, the Swedish government also announced a plan to borrow about 43.8 trillion won by 2035. This shows their drive to quickly grow military power even if it requires major investment. In particular, Sweden is considered one of the countries in Europe with a low national debt ratio, so this is seen as a strategy to increase defense investment by using its fiscal capacity. Notably, Sweden's security policy has reached a historic turning point. For over 200 years, Sweden avoided direct war involvement and upheld military neutrality. They had maintained a diplomatic policy of keeping a certain distance from Russia and not belonging to any particular bloc. After the Ukraine war, Sweden quickly shifted its position, seeing Russia's actions as a threat to European security. Sweden then dropped its neutrality and joined NATO. Now part of NATO's collective defense, Sweden is preparing for joint defense with other members and has shifted its strategy to label Russia a major security threat. Of course, there are also opinions like this. Some question whether Russia, which is already spending more time and resources than expected in the war in Ukraine, really has the capacity to open another front. Because Russia is focused on deploying troops and equipment to Ukraine, many analysts think it's unlikely Russia will attack Sweden soon. However, what the Swedish government is focusing on is not the immediate possibility of war. The purpose of security policy is not to respond after an actual attack, but to prepare in advance so that the opponent cannot even attempt an attack. Sweden is considering not only the current state of Russia's military power, but also how it could be rebuilt in the coming years. Since it's unclear when or how the war in Ukraine will end, Sweden isn't ruling out that Russia could shift its military focus back to the Nordic and Baltic regions afterward. For these reasons, Sweden believes it's more efficient to start strengthening its defense capabilities immediately instead of wasting time. Rearming Gotland follows the same logic. Having enough troops, equipment, and infrastructure in peacetime makes it much harder for an adversary to plan military action. Combining this with NATO's defense system is expected to further strengthen deterrence in the Baltic region. Sweden is pursuing a strategy to maintain stable control over Gotland, strengthen its influence in the Baltic region, and serve as a key base for NATO's northern defense network.